Jordan, very good to see you, and thank you for coming and talking to me. I understand it's somewhat of a special day for you, and so I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, you're welcome. I felt like our last conversation had a certain, well, let's see, I felt had a certain beauty to it. And so when you reached out this time, I thought, yeah, let's just continue that thread.
Yeah, I had the same feeling as well, and I did. I did reach out to you because you've been on a couple of other podcasts recently talking about your conversion to Christianity, which in a way I'm sort of embarrassed about kind of jumping on the bandwagon and talking about this because it seems to be a big deal to people somehow. I've kind of considered myself a religious person for a long time, not within the Christian tradition. At least I consider myself to be connected in that sense. But so many people aren't. And so many people who we talk to just have no interest or, even a animosity towards religion. So I guess I'm wondering about that. I'm wondering about your journey towards becoming religious. You've covered that in detail, that your story on the podcast with others. So maybe in this conversation we can sort of go deep into your feelings towards Christianity, how that happened, what was your sort of like road to Damascus, so to speak.
Well, it wasn't quite that intense. Well, at least not all at once. Maybe if you were to concentrate the entire experience of, let's say, 30 years into 15 minutes, maybe it was that intense. It's interesting to think about it that way. Sure. So maybe as some background, Daniel Thorsten grabbed me and said, hey, would you be willing to share this publicly? And so that was the first podcast. I covered kind of a part of the story. And then Jim Rutt, who I had scheduled to have a conversation with about Civium months ago, said, I want to have this conversation about Christianity as well. So those two podcasts are out. And then subsequent to that, but not yet public, I think, the folks from Doomer Optimism had a conversation with me, I think 3 days ago. And then Ken Lowry and I had a beautiful conversation yesterday. I think, if you happen to be interested in this at all, I think you really like that one. That's the favorite conversation I've had so far. And so, my rule for 2 decades has been, I never reach out. I never seek to be on a show. I never invite anybody to, chatting with me. But if somebody invites me, and I have two feelings. One feeling is that they're coming in good faith, and that our conversation will be of kind of a higher service. This has been the case for 20 years. Well, I guess the third rule is that I have time, energy, and emotional resilience to engage in the conversation. Then I say yes. So there's been I think as you say, there's something like maybe a potential energy or a building up of water behind a dam where my coming out in a certain way has tapped into something that's out there. And so there's a meaningful amount of interest, and it comes from a variety of different locations. And so this is why I wasn't too concerned about saying a lot of yeses, because you talk to a different group of people than Ken talks to, for example. There's some of it's not really, I don't think, that much overlap. And more importantly, the perspective is different. And so this is kind of like the hyper conversation processing of something. Like if I think about it as a multiplicity event as opposed to sort of me, then it's more interesting. So that's the way I'm coming at it, at least in this context. So let's see. So bring me back in. What's the place that you'd like to focus on? The road to Damascus.
Yeah. I mean, your road has been very long. And I was contemplating on the difference between perhaps, myself and you, as we tend to do, and styles of being. And you're a very insightful, intelligent person who's, worked in tech, and you strike me as, just I've appreciated your thinking for a long time. Also I sense feeling behind that as well, but I sense that you're a thinking person. And if I compare yourself to me, I think that I became sort of religious in my 20s, from feeling and not having thought it through, which is very different. I just sort of jumped into it, and I feel like you've thought it through, which is kind of interesting.
I have thought it through. I think that's very fair. So to kind of begin to put I don't know, Silk Road, some kind of road, some milestones in place. And so I never found myself in the atheist eddy, from the point of view of thinking it through. So from my perspective, and I'm very happy to kind of like defend this perspective, even I think the 10, 11, or 12-year-old me, it was quite clear that the frame of atheism is incoherent. It's not a rational frame. It's ultimately an emotional frame that uses rational arguments to defend its emotional position. So it actually fits more deeply in the feeling domain than anything else. But the feelings are hurt feelings. So I sat in an agnostic location for a very long time, and an agnostic location with the dial set very high on hocus pocus, say, for example. You're made up, or on the kind of both the logical rigor and the metaphysical, like the philosophical robustness of things coming in. And so, of course, and then, of course, suffering from the bias of our culture and my particular thrownness into our culture, which is a bias that up until recently I didn't fully grasp, which is an anti-Christian bias. And so our culture has an anti-Christian bias, and certainly the culture that I dropped into had an anti-Christian bias. And by the way, even Christians often have that anti-Christian bias, which we can maybe delve into a little bit. So this ended up with my adopting something like a Neil deGrasse Tyson or Stephen Hawking's Feynman mid-century Apollo program, take a man to the moon, food and pill form, techno-optimistic, and then later more of a cypherpunk hacker ethos sensibility. And so somewhere in the naturalistic, not quite materialistic, because obviously, again, materialism is also incoherent, but holding in something in the naturalistic frame and working mostly in that area. And of course, my life focus, for the most part, was in the crossovers between the technical realm, the entrepreneurial realm, and the science philosophical realm. So I kind of lived all three of those. I think in some conversation I mentioned another milestone. So now we're much further down the lines from being 12. Now we're in maybe 30, 31, something like that. Sitting in the waiting room at the Googleplex, waiting to go have a conversation with Sergey Brin because Google is making an offer to buy my company. And I have a copy of Gilles Deleuze's Difference in Repetition that I'm reading. And so that's actually, I think, a very nice, like that's a location. And Deleuze, in some sense, I was actually just listening to James Cortati's beautiful video. It's crazy. He said like 6 people in the world may be interested in this video, where he's comparing the abstract machine of Deleuze with the symbolic Pantocrator coming from Jonathan Pajot, and it's good. Go back and watch it maybe 2 more times, maybe even meet him in person. But I think Deleuze is a good model of where I was. Highly abstract, opening up new ways of thinking about this, the notion of the virtual, for example, which is not the actual or the material, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, a natural, realist, philosophical frame. And to the degree to which it cashes out in changes in physical reality, which is a stronger rule than just empirical science. Right? Empirical science is a repeatable experiment, which is a measurable change in physical reality. But for example, building transistors is a more meaningful demonstration of something than just you can do something in the lab. That was kind of my epistemology. to be perfectly honest. Epistemology was one of, if you can build levers that move rocks, then great. Whatever's behind that is probably pretty more real than others. And that, like, that arc brings me in all the way through into the kind of the earliest Game B era. So we're talking 2010, 2012, somewhere in there. And during that time frame, I went through the portal of I guess transparadigmatic mind is maybe the key element there.
Can I throw another word in there? I mean, that I was thinking about in relation to you and your your writings on the Blue Church, etc. I was saying Jordan was a very apocalyptic writer, and like in the sense of apocalypse, in the Christian sense, which is different than the meaning crisis, in the sense that everybody is a zombie, because the apocalypse is about redemption in some kind of a way. Or so I felt like your early writings, while even not being explicitly Christian, and while almost everybody is very Christian without even knowing it in our culture, a Protestant, right, that there was an intense apocalypticism to your writing.
In the sense of like to reveal, right?
Yes.
The turning, a shifting. Quite. I found myself in a using the previous sort of epistemology and methodology, perceiving through the lens of complex system science and cultural evolutionary theory, which is an extension of complex take biological evolutionary theory, expand it into a more abstract form using kind of complexity architectures, and then you can apply it across fields like culture. This thing that we're part of is in a moment of profound transformation. And one of the consequences of that is that we are going to be forced into a conscious experience of things that have been laying under the surface for a very long time. And this will be both at the axiology level, like axioms that we've just been unconsciously assuming, and at the practical level. For example, that governments don't actually serve the interest of the governed in a way that's very difficult to deny. Like, so delusions will be disdiluted, and us under unconscious assumptions will be raised to the surface, simply because that's the natural consequence of the moment that we happen to be in. And then the next piece was, okay, the moment we happen to be in presages not just a profound change, but a profound transformation or responsibility, that we actually have to move into this creative moment. And that from a, I would say, anthropological and cognitive distributed cognition perspective, this movement into this creative moment requires a raising of consciousness. And I don't mean this necessarily in the kind of the woo sense. I mean this in a very practical sense of what is the word that we use to describe our mental capacity to perceive and be in relationship with some set of phenomena in the world, some sort of our level of consciousness. And when we raise our level of consciousness, we expand the dimensionality and the scope of that. And if the problem we're dealing with is beyond a certain scope, we have to raise our consciousness to perceive it. It's a richer word than, say, for example, increasing our memory bandwidth or increasing our CPU speed, which is sort of narrow band in a very particular form of intelligence. But if you increase the richness of what you mean by intelligence, now you're speaking about consciousness. As
Seems like it has the element of caring, like consciousness caring rather than just intelligence. There's a caring in consciousness that isn't.
C-A-R or C-A-R-R-Y?
Caring, like, in the Heideggerian sense, to care, I guess.
And to even say, like, to be in relationship with, which is the precursor to a quality of relationship known as caring. So that then moved me into a phase of then, from a thinking it through perspective, it is, from my point of view, demonstrably necessary to figure out what it means to go about this consciousness thing and this raising of consciousness thing. And also being aware of the fact that it requires and this word is now common currency, but at the time it certainly wasn't, at least within my world, a liminal moment, moving to a place where you have to disconnect yourself from the orienting basis that biases your understanding, because that may actually be the thing that needed to shift. And so you have to have something akin to zero in the meditation, we call it the U. Who that was, Otto Schermer, maybe. And you go to the bottom of the U, and from a liminal perspective, it's like a ball going to the top of its arc and hitting zero velocity, zero momentum vectors until it's ready to start falling back down again. And that entered into the journey, which we could broadly call spirituality. So opening up new areas of possibility, exploring those areas of possibility directly, having embodied experiences that started to accumulate. Okay, this appears to be part of reality, and doesn't fit within previous frames. Okay, what does it look like to go down that path? And so that's kind of 2013 to 2023, 2022. And then as we start getting into 2022, go ahead.
So that's the movement, let's say, from mechanical solutions or intellectual solutions, to spiritual solutions, whatever that means. Gurdjieff talked about mechanical man, right? And that one becomes religious at the point where spiritual or whatever, when one perceives something beyond the mechanical, which, is perennially called divine, or, and different things in different traditions.
Yeah, I mean, initially you could just say, as you say, something beyond.
Yeah. Transcendence, perhaps, or
transcendence is nice. Yeah, something in the category of transcendence. The category of transcendence is a category. It's a piece. It's reality. And okay, that's you go there. Once you get there, now you're on a journey. And so for me, that involved reading a lot of authors, finding out who Gurdjieff was, participating in was it the Bohm Krishnamurti dialogues, talking with people from the anthroposophia and the theosophia, and of course, more of the traditional religions, most notably not Christian, by the way, but Kabbalahs and Hindus and various Buddhist flavors and things like that. And in many cases, practicing some of those techniques and getting involved in those practices, and plenty of medicine journeys to use the contemporary, maximally uncriminal or unviolating language, all of which is in that same box. Like, okay, WT, here's different people who have perspectives on it. They claim to have certain insight and understanding. Let's go into that, explore it, see if we can metabolize it. But always actually with this.
So that's everything but Christianity. Sorry to interrupt, isn't it? It's like,
ultimately, ultimately. Shamanic practices, indigenous practices. But as you say, from a dispositional perspective, still this role of thinking it through. And so, how we actually, my wife and Vanessa and I had conversations about how at this point do you know when you're not actually just insane? At what point do you know that you've not lost your mind? What's the thing that you can use to tether yourself that is sort of stronger than empirical science has a particular way of tethering itself to reality to avoid mysticism or to avoid superstition, right? How do you actually have confidence that your explanations are real explanations? And we essentially built a larger kind of framework of, all right, how do we enter into these liminal moments where underlying hypotheses and metaphysics about the nature of reality are now going to be rendered open without losing our minds entirely? Like, what does that look like? So, maintaining, I guess, a dispositional orientation towards rigor was definitely part of that journey. And, you may recall there was the entering into the religious phase, roughly 2022, 2021. And this for me began actually when I was looking at, oddly enough, economics. So I was looking at economics and I noticed that you can't do economics properly until we actually recognize that the false dichotomy of state and market is a false dichotomy. And if there's a third term, known as the commons, that we have to explore. And then the inquiry was, okay, what is the commons? And then as it turns out, the exploration was, the concept of the commons is actually better understood as the concept of the sacred. but the sacred is the deep basis upon which the category of the commons is attached.
That changes everything, doesn't it? I mean,
that changes everything. Yeah, absolutely. And so then the question is, what does an orderly approach to the sacred look like? Like, what does governance in the category of the sacred look like? All right, well, now we're starting to get in the domain of religion. And we're getting into the domain of what are the liturgies whereby we ravel ourselves together from a disparate multiplicity in the context of the sacred into communion, for example. Like, that's a very religious sensibility. Not very, that is a precisely religious sensibility. And yet maintaining and holding this unconscious or pseudo-conscious bias where Christianity is still beyond the pale. And so the language that John Vervaeke coined and owns, I don't own it in any way, of the religion that's not a religion, which, you know, is actually in some sense a very nice, ultimately come like a process or an algorithm of, okay, we know that we have baby in bathwater. We want to throw out the water, but we don't want to throw out the baby. We're not quite clear how to do that. So how do we separate baby and bathwater? That's effectively what that phrase means.
You want to just get rid of the ugly dogmatism and you know, of religion, and then find out what the essence is, or what, you know, what the truest part of that is.
Yeah, which is itself a religious process if taken properly.
Yeah.
And you know, that exploration was a very deep exploration, and taking a look at that and beginning to do things like, for a moment, I called it the rectification of names. So noticing how many terms that are in the category of religion and or the category of transcendent.
Oh, that's a good subject. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, have been just turned upside down, and in many cases deliberately and intentionally, but even if not, rendered confusing. So words like faith, for example, or
supernatural. Everybody uses that as to cast aspersions on religion, but they have all kinds of supernatural sort of assumptions that they don't question, you know, at the same time, and we all do. So I always thought that's kind of a funny one. But
yeah, and oddly enough, I was just having a chat about exactly that. That the word supernatural has been tagged as shorthand for meaning hocus pocus or for sure made up, right? And for sure made up in a maximally stupid and or manipulative way. Like, that's like kind of what the word supernatural means in that culture vernacular. And then, you know, faith means something like kind of maximally degenerate delusional beliefs, something like that. Obviously, that's what you think it means, then you're not going to participate in it. So it's like sort of a perfect way of painting shit all over.
And also the people who are engaged in those critiques are full of all kinds of bizarre forms of faith, which they haven't questioned within their own souls, I would say. I mean, it's always the case.
Soul's another one, by the way, but not.
Yeah, soul's another word. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and if I wanted to do kind of the lefty thing and psychologize those who are making that critique, it's because they've actually built that aversion in their own soul. And so, of course, they can't directly deal with their own faith because they avoid their own faith. And so it ends up being quite, how do you say, either random willy-nilly or perverse. Because they can't look at it directly because they believe that faith is a bad idea in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, and I find that, like, I've noticed I've been in events which resemble church, although they're not in a Christian building, and the words that are coming out are not Christian, but people are behaving. There's a preacher up there, and there's a bunch of people sitting in chairs, and they're shaking each other's hands, and they're doing, you know, they're repeating different things, and it's like the church. They're the most, you know, hipster kind of people who are, you know, way beyond ordinary Christianity, who are behaving like Presbyterians. So anyway.
Yeah, in fact, maybe we can kind of intercept there, because I think I ended up participating in a lot of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because I didn't fully grasp the necessity, and the word necessity is critical. It needs to be sort of underlined 2 or 3 times. The necessity of God in any effort to do religion, or let's say proper liturgy. So we can form liturgies, we can create communion. We do it all the time. Sometimes it's even has a Presbyterian form. Sometimes it's the Super Bowl. But we do that all the time. We can't even help do it. It's how multiplicity forms unity. It's how we form groups that are able to have an identity that does something as a group. That's just a natural function. Yeah. That's not the problem.
Yeah, I mean, even what I said, I didn't mean that to sound mean-spirited. I think it's a kind of a natural thing. It's not always bad, but
yeah. That is not the problem. The problem is something like proper orientation or directionality and proper, how do you say it right? Not integration, not architecture. Well, let's say
I'd say wholeness, like the thing has to be whole.
Yeah, whole and wholesome, right? Whole and wholesome.
Wholesome, yeah, you used that word before.
It has to be well integrated. It has to be well integrated in a fashion which is based upon a deep health. Maybe that's a good way of putting it. And I'm speaking about kind of the embryological perspective, right? So the process whereby this very insanely, intensely complex process of the grabbing of molecules out of the uterine environment milieu and out of the placental milieu, and then the assembling of them into this extremely highly complex organism, how it works, right? It actually hangs together as a well-formed human. And how do you avoid the errors? How do you make sure that you don't accidentally have an arm growing out of your forehead or that your heart's reversed, which sometimes happens, and oftentimes, most of the time, is terminal. So that thing, whatever that process is, something Genesis is probably the right word. So that then becomes very close to the center of the heart of the religious problem. Like, how do we do communion, but how do we do communion right? How do we do it well? How do we do it in a fashion which is both whole and in relationship with the whole, like the largest whole?
Yeah.
We're also wholesome, right? It orients us towards a higher and higher health, something which is well constituted and well integrated.
And there are ways that people have been thinking about that for thousands of years, and so it's a very strange thing that people are trying to invent this out of nowhere, in a sense.
Well, I wouldn't say that
in some ways, but when it's all kind of there, right? Why wouldn't you go into the older versions of that have some kind of a staying power?
So let's pick that apart. That's okay. So me first, do me first, and then third persons to keep it kind of in the right location. So I guess I've always run through both an aesthetic filter. I actually have a profoundly aesthetic sense of it. And then a kind of an intellectual rigorousness filter, and both. And I kind of try to use both to parallax.
Truth and beauty.
Yeah, truth and beauty. And if I'm sitting in a room and there's people who are ostensibly well-intentioned and trying to do something like religion, this kind of maybe a new age context, and I have an aesthetic sense of like something's a little bit off, then I will respond with something's a little bit off. And so just FYI, and that happened all the time, constantly. I would be in a context where people are doing the thing like you're talking about, where okay, that looks like church. In fact, maybe it's even calling itself church, and there's something right. But there's also something weirdly wrong, and I can't really put my finger on it, but I'm going to pull back from that because I don't want to get involved in something I don't understand and feels wrong, what's over there, and then try to use this rigor thing to figure it out. Okay, so that's me. So let's move over here. I think it's important to acknowledge two things. One is that the older religions failed in some deeply catastrophic way. And I mean, let's just say, for example, the 30 Years' War, the schisms of the Orthodox and the Catholic, 1,200 years ago, the schisms between the Protestants and the Catholics, and the bloody wars that happened, right? And that was happening in the birth of the United States, and in many cases, frankly, the birth of modernity. Modernity was born out of whoa, this is bad, like super bad, really not good. What do we do? How do we find a place to find peace? and certainly the birth of liberalism was seated in a skepticism of the capacity of Christendom to produce peace. Right? That's a wound. That's a very profound wound, and it was an earned wound. It was a real thing. Christendom did not successfully produce peace for generations. Okay, now what? So let's try something else. And at least within the context of religion, in the context of Christendom, liberalism has successfully produced peace. We actually haven't had meaningful conflicts between Protestants and Catholics. However, we have created new religions called Nazism and communism, and those guys have been producing lots of blood. So it didn't sort of solve the problem categorically. But we need to be mindful of the fact that that wound still very much lives in our culture and is a big part of the hesitancy to hearken back to the old.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then the second thing is that there has been waged a very successful mimetic propaganda war, much of which is material, on the part of the Enlightenment project against the characteristics of religion that initially were purely the bad parts, let's say, or superstitions, for example, or power. Okay, the church is endeavoring to engage in power control that's well outside of its proper scope. So we're going to fight that fight, but of course, as the fight got fought, it expanded and expanded and expanded. So we're living again many generations on the other side of that. So those who are anti-religious can do things like point to the moon missions and point to transistors and lasers and say, thus I demonstrate the truth of my world. Where's your demonstration of the truth of your world? You went through the Black Death, and there were churches full of people who died praying for salvation and healing. I've got penicillin. You got it. So the secular world created an arena, or found itself in an arena, and then successfully ran the table in that arena against the sacred world. And we live in the aftermath of that as well. And so people who are then coming in the late 20th, early 21st century, young people, generally speaking, who are noticing the necessity of the spiritual and noticing ultimately the necessity of the religious. You move from kind of an agnostic atheist to spiritual, not religious, and then you move from spiritual, not religious, to endeavoring to assemble some kind of new religion, are actually doing this religion is not a religion process. Okay, we're not going to go back and connect with an ancient lineage, qua lineage, either because it's just been cut, and there isn't such a thing right now, or because we don't trust it. But we are going to try to go back and assemble. And by the way, since we're doing that, why don't we do the perennial philosophy thing? Why don't we grab all religions? Like, why would we pick any particular lineage? We can't even choose between Protestantism, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy. So screw it. I'm going to open it up. We're going to look at multiple different lineages of Hinduism and Buddhism and shamanic practices. Like, it's all these things that are under the category of old-fashioned religious lineages, and we're going to put that in a big toolkit. Of course, this is a very mid-century, Aldous Huxley and all those guys program. We're going to try to pull them out, and we're going to try to figure out how to produce a more refined version of what they were doing and assemble that into a new construct. I would say that's the actual project that, at its best, that has been going on coming from that world. It's not a from scratch ab nihilo. It's a grab, look at, rotate, blow the dust off, chop this piece, stick it together kind of a thing. A little bit like, post-apocalyptic people coming across an old junkyard full of cars. Like, okay, none of these are working cars, but maybe we can harvest pieces and
put something together that works. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And which is all well and good, but, and herein lies the problem. Who's your God at the end of the day? What ended up being imported, broadly speaking, was either narcissism, which is say, I am my God.
Oh my God. Okay.
Or the mind, right? Or technology, right? Some variation on that theme. And then that's tricky, right? Because if I am ultimately the ground that is judging what is baby and what is bathwater, if I am judging what pieces of these old lineages are right and true and trying to throw away and judging what needs to be thrown away, then I am putting myself in the position of being the ultimate determinant of what is capital T true. Well, that's
Yeah.
tricky, right? That's tricky because then ultimately I'm importing me as the actual center of the universe. And by the way, given the fact that we live in the most narcissistic age ever by lots, by margins, that's like a low energy point that's hard to escape from. Like if you're using a methodology that is sort of implicitly narcissistic and you live in a narcissistic world and therefore are probably deeply narcissistic in lots of unconscious ways, it's going to be difficult to escape from. So a lot of those efforts are captured in that location. And then the other, even lower energy place, of course, is technology. It's going to be the God. And of course, this language is now relatively commonplace. It's like we are building gods in the AI and robotics world. And you can kind of see how easy it is to get there because it has the tremendous advantage of actually proving itself. Yeah, we can build rockets, we can build, penicillin, we can, this methodology, this process whereby we prove truth, capital T truth, and the epistemology of science produces capital T truth in a way that religions, let's say in the past, weren't able to. Let's put our chips on that. And of course, now it's become quite self-defined. Right? Effective accelerationism is a teleological, even an eschatological religion, premised entirely upon the escape velocity of the techno-intellectual world.
Yeah. And you might buy that if you didn't have another sort of organ, Kirchhoff would call it organ, that senses that there's something not quite right about it. And you said something interesting in your previous interview, I think it was with Jim, about beauty often being the primary, let's say, not truth in the sense, this is true and this is not true. It was, there seems to be kind of a macho type of attitude towards reality, more like something calls to you, and then you hear that calling, and it doesn't have like it doesn't necessarily have a name that you can that you can go out and advertise and tell people what it is. I mean, that's been my experience anyway. It hasn't been like, okay, I, with my ego, I personality go and search for this thing and then find it. That doesn't work. It kind of finds you, or it kind of appears to you. I mean, beauty finds you. You don't can't construct it in a way.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Language, yeah, absolutely. This language that I was just reading, I think 2 nights ago, was something like, the creation story. The God was so beautiful that he allured non-being out of itself into being.
I like that.
So beautiful that even non-being was pulled into beingness. I was like,
right. That's the only way that non-being will ever be pulled into beingness, because non-beingness is just mechanical and
can't go into it.
Yeah.
So yes, I think this is actually, we're getting down to a very precise ground. So as I began to move into this last phase, the aesthetic piece was quite potent. The experiences that I was having in here, which I had been trained, by the way, in my Civium journeys to notice the difference between a wholesome and a non-wholesome community in a very profound way. Like, where does the wholesomeness coming from? Is it just superficial or is it deep? And as I found myself here, I noticed that I was in a truly wholesome community, profoundly wholesome across a wide variety of different dimensions. And the aesthetic sensibility was lighting up. Okay, this is good direction. Keep going in this direction. Follow it wherever it leads you. Attract it into. And ultimately that landed me in a Christian church. I mean, to kind of teleport through things that I've talked about this sort of stuff in previous podcasts, so I don't want to belabor the point. And then I had to come to terms with my own personal allergy, and then our cultural allergy, which had been prohibiting me or preventing me from being able to engage that lineage honestly. Like, let's just say honesty is exactly the right word. And with the adequate level of effort to work through the various prevarications and slanders that had been produced and hardwired into concepts, again, like say faith and supernatural. There's a swimming against that process that had to happen for a while to recover those elements so that I could then begin to navigate this space on its own terms and properly. And so the aesthetic was enough to hold me in that piece. And then I applied an intellectual effort over a period of several months of significant intensity and kept noticing. And there was a lot of encouragement because I would notice, as it turns out, my perspective on this question was completely confused. And in many ways, the upside down. And so my sort of inhibition or my concern with this piece of it was actually illusory. It wasn't really with it. It was with a projection or a frame of it. As I begin to understand it on its own terms, I begin to realize that it makes a whole lot of sense, like a profound sense. In many ways, it resolves problems that I've been holding on to for a while. I'm now stepping into a higher degree of freedom as a result of integrating with, say, for example, sin, as to put one out there that's quite challenging to navigate through. And then the last sort of 6 months of that piece, 3 months of kind of a deep being held at a place of trying to chop my way through, and then increasingly getting velocity, like increasingly being able to punch through concepts, punch through notions, realize that my previous conceptions were negative or improper biases, and then beginning to live it, and noticing that as I lived it more and more deeply, it unfolded more and more richly, and that relationships just began to show up that were, wholesome, like they were woven of the right kind of fabric. And the liturgical consequences of entering into this properly were increasingly evident in life, in myself, in my relationship with my wife, my daughter, and friends and community, etc. And that sort of brought me to the threshold of saying, okay, I'm in. I will be baptized into this as a member of this lineage.
Interesting to me, like we talked about beauty and the calling of the aesthetics, and I live in France, and you can see this remnants of an extremely intense kind of culture that doesn't exist so much anymore. There's this sort of layer of the secular culture, and then there's this deep layer that's there but not being used, it would appear to me. So that was one thought I had, and the other thought I had was, it's interesting that your wife kind of brought you there, led you there, because that's kind of, it's a calling that comes from the aesthetic, or comes from falling in love in a sense, rather than an aesthetic of figuring it out in some sort of rational
that's really quite beautiful if you think about it in terms of a partnership, or which a marriage must be. That the aesthetic, the beautiful, the falling in love led and held, and then the rational, and this was actually quite practical. She would ask me lots of questions. Her journey was parallel to mine. Like, she has a whole story which she may or may not share, of also struggling with a lot of these questions. She was raised Catholic, so she had a different sort of set of and so we would sit down and we would actually hash through the thinking through part. So kind of in the container of falling in love, the thinking through part was still very much there. I'm saying, okay. And, in many ways asking, she would ask the questions, which is kind of perfect. She would ask the question and I would try to respond to the questions. And then she would sort of have a sense of, yes, that's going, what you're saying makes sense and it's hanging together, or no, that's wrong or off, or something's missing. And so we had this dialogical process together that contained all these different elements. So that's actually nice to put in there, by the way. This is not my journey, this is our journey.
Right. So I was also thinking, as you were speaking, you said that, there was a sort of accumulation of insights that led you to be able to get it, because in breaking through kind of whatever superficial or cultural or, super ego notions of what thing is. I was thinking that and then you mentioned in your other talk that like you got the Trinity, and that you understood the Trinity. And so So I wanted to ask you about that. I know that's an enormous topic. Like that's probably like a 5 hour podcast,
Oh,
I'm interested in, it's like, what is it that you saw in the Trinity that you found so profound?
okay. So first, somewhat interesting is that as you sort of began shifting into this new topic, um, I noticed that I had two things lined up. One was the transcendent, and the second one was the Trinity.
Mm.
And then when you said the Trinity, it's like, that's apropos. So if I want to kind of put the big arc into big milestones, particularly for anybody who's kind of vaguely coming from the world that I came from, I would say the first portal is the transcendent. And so, hey,
Mm.
if you're living in a world that doesn't have the transcendent as a part of it, that's wrong. And so add the
Mm.
transcendent, and, that's a journey, but that's a really good, how do I say, I will put my chips in that, do
Yeah.
that. Okay,
Yeah.
so then when you're in the transcendent, and now you're kind of in the world of, say, spiritual, not religious at a minimum, or experimenting with different kinds of religion, or frankly even an existing religious lineage, but we'll fight that fight. The Trinity. Okay, so as you said, no, I do not understand the Trinity. That's not the right way of describing it. In fact, something like one major piece of the Trinity is the way I visualize it is kind of like a crown, and the vertical part of the crown is orienting in the direction of the mystery. So it's beyond understanding almost by necessity or by definition. And then there's the part of the crown that in some sense you can put on your head, and that is the limits of understanding. And so when you take okay, so we'll go back. So I had trained my mind on Western philosophy, and then brought in a lot of Eastern philosophy as well, but very heavily trained on Western, Greek, Platonic, a little bit of medieval, tons of contemporary. So like people like Foucault and Deleuze and folks like that. And there's a lot of sort of basic, deep, bottom of the stack philosophical questions like unity and multiplicity. And what are the ontological primitives of any possible reality? And what happened is as I was, it's funny, when I first encountered the Trinity, by necessity, right? Shoot, thinking about Christianity, I'm going to have to deal with the Trinity. It was about as far into the the yucky or to be avoided piece. Like I had original frame of it as being a very sloppy and silly, weird, superstitious nonsense. I don't even have the right language for it exactly yet, but it was not even. It's like a bad comic book, something like that. A poorly written comic book. Okay, but now I have to take this seriously, so I started delving into it. And of course, my very first experience was, oh, these guys are legit, super legit. They were thinking about this stuff hard, and oh shoot, okay, so at the bottom of the Trinity, you have the basic ontology of unity and multiplicity in relationship, where relationality is more fundamental. And so we have now characteristics. Think about any ontology you want to build with. You have to have an ontology that includes the notion of unity or identity. So like you, Andy, or stars, or chairs, or anything that has a notion of beingness. And it has to have multiplicity, which includes both the process of how does unity produce multiplicity, differentiation. How does multiplicity integrate into multiplicity and into unity, so communion, and just the category of multiplicity at all, like as a thing, threeness, and then relationality has unity and multiplicity come into relationship, and the relationality is more fundamental, and this is the big thing that's happening right now. Is this phrase the relationship is more fundamental than the relata. This is a kind of a profound ontological proposition, which I'm not going to defend necessarily explain right now, but the key takeaway is that if we have, let's say, for example, we just say you and me, oh gosh, trying to make it simple is not easy. Yeah, I'll just state it as such. If people are interested in investigating it, there's ways for that to be investigated, but the proposition that an ontology that is premised on particular beings is unable to properly account for relationship, but an ontology that is premised on relationality is able to include the beings or the relata that are in relationship. But at the very, very bottom of that has to be something which is pure relationality in the most sort of fundamental, and I don't want to say abstract, but pure sense. And now we're going to start hitting even faster. If something is pure relationality, then we have to talk about what are the characteristics that are intrinsic to the notion of relationality, which is to say that it has to have the ability to be in relationship with. Well, we have something which has the ability to be in relationship with, and we're going to have something that has the characteristic of creativity or creation, which is one of the categories of relationship.
Mm-hmm.
We can, if you'd like to, we can unpack, for example, why the Trinity is constructed where you have Father, Son, and Spirit. Father has the location of creation, creator, generator, paternity. Son has the characteristic of creation in essence, a begottenness, which is a quality or a kind of relationality within the subset of creation or creativity. By the way, I can't help but end up being an anti-philoloque person. So this puts me into the Orthodox camp, not the Catholic camp.
Sorry, you're going to have to explain that to me.
There was the beauty of the history of our religion is that, at least in some sense, and only maybe a minor sense, but nonetheless a non-trivial sense, the basis of the great schism that split the Church of Christendom, whatever it was, 1100 AD or something like that, between the Eastern and the Western churches, was that the Western Church, the Pope, introduced a phrase in the Creed, which was that the Son is begotten from the Father,
mm-hmm.
And that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. So, and the Son, or filioque, with filioque would be the Latin for and the
mm-hmm.
Son. And the Eastern are like, no. The creed before that was the Son is begotten of the Father, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father, sometimes with the Son, but there's no notion of proceeding coming from Father and Son. And this is it's funny. Of course, we're talking about the Trinity, so we're in a place mm-hmm. of extremely esoteric, abstract language, but the notion that the geometry. Okay, let me see if I can say it right. So obviously, we're now thinking about something in the category of eternity. So we have to be thinking in the same way that we would think about math. And so,
mm-hmm. For example. Well, what about this, Jordan? Can I throw in like a Buddhist thing, which is a way for me to try to understand this? Is like the non-duality of duality and non-duality. That's a triad, right? Is that the three kayas of the Buddha? The Buddha has three bodies. One is unmanifest, one is subtle, and one is here. It's love, or it's.
Okay.
So does that map on at all to the Trinity? I mean, that's the Buddhist Trinity, you could say, but
I would say we have to, although I don't understand it well enough. But for example, that notion of love, right? Love speaks to the notion of relationality in its essence, right? What love requires a beloved, right? A lover and a beloved to be loved, which means that love, right? Think about the relationship is more fundamental than a relata. Love taken as love is pure relationality. And then it, by its nature, calls forth, because it calls the beloved and the lover, which are characteristics that are intrinsic to the notion of love. But any particular beloved and lover are not the thing that defines love. Love defines its own essence, to say. Mm-hmm. So that's the key, is to put it there. But then we have to have the ability to be in, and this is the big difference between the Christian and the Buddhist, of how do you say, personhood, right? So it's not an undifferentiated or a non-personal, impersonal. And the Trinity brings forth the notion of personhood in necessity. And we could think about that in terms of what is the surface area or the volume of relationality. Pure relationality, to be the kind of the highest possible point. Remember, we're trying to find something that's at the top of the stack.
Mm-hmm.
Principle. What is that with which you, and Sweeney, can have the most intimate relationship with, the highest possible complete relationship with, which is you're able to unfold yourself and come into contact with the most, well, some aspects of you, mostly intellectual aspects, can come into a conceptual relationship with impersonal, right? The impersonal. It's almost like the intellectual is nature, it's the impersonal. But your heart can't come into relationship with the impersonal. It's not the nature of the heart.
Yeah.
The heart has to come into relationship in person, right? It's a personal relationship in its essence. Like there's no other way around it. So even kind of like a proof of existence, the fact that we humans have this diversity of capacities of relationality, which we have with each other, right? I can be in relationship with you impersonally, and I can be in relationship with you personally. Well, then the category of personal relationship must be included in that which represents the whole of the whole.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I fully agree with that as, a practicing Vajrayana Buddhist, which is different, I think, than the Mahayana and the Hinayana Buddhists, in that relationality is the ultimate thing. That intimacy and relationality is the ultimate. So that part I don't feel to be contradictory to my own path, in a sense.
Oh, wow. So what I'm perceiving is that I would propose, and I don't know if this is accurate, obviously, but I would propose that if I'm correct, that the Trinity is the most compact, necessary, and sufficient for any possible reality. And we can do that work conceptually, and then we notice that to actually do it properly, we then have to do it actually relationally. That the variation, like the process of, say, Buddhism, would arrive at the same location. And then the big difference is that Christianity has the incarnation, which Buddhism has a variation on that slightly, but not quite. And the incarnation is also necessary. This is important. The incarnation is in fact necessary for a maximally complete, compact, let's say, ontology of God. You have to have Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and we can sort of talk about how that maps to different categories of different religions. We have to have this notion of begotten, this notion of proceeding. We have to have pure relationality. We have to have love. We have to have unity, multiplicity. We have to have community. We have to have differentiation. We have to have all those characteristics. And then as we start moving further and further, we actually get this one particular piece that comes out, right, from the eternal into time. And there has to be a movement where the full personhood, the full personhood of the divine manifests itself incarnate, right? Makes itself part of the chronological flow to enable the suturing or the communion to actually have a touch point that is available to that which is operating at the level of the finite. So
wonderful. Oh.
So that's where when I sort of went through all those checks, like check, and I landed on it. Then I had the aesthetic sense, of what happens when we come into harmony. Like when you've got a bunch of people who are just beginning to try to find harmony, and then suddenly you hear, right? There's a click, right? There's like everything's moving, there's a click, and you're in harmony. And I was like, whoa! Like I've thought about a lot of things. I mean, worked with Forrest Landry stuff for years. All those boxes are getting checked, and as I check these boxes, I notice an increasing felt sensation of harmony. And then when that last piece dropped of the necessity of incarnation, then it was a profound feeling of not just, this is exactly right, not a profound feeling of feeling harmony, but a profound feeling of participating in harmony. And that I think probably is the actual moment of my conversion right there. If you really want to put a very fine point on it, sitting there, reading, thinking, reading, and then all of a sudden, something like I actually became part of this thing. I transitioned from being third person thinking about it to noticing my way. I was noticing a way of coming into relationship with it, where suddenly the relationship clicked. And I was actually just part of it. I was part of the whole,
Right.
in a very particular kind of way, right? Not a drop in the ocean part of a whole, but a very particular kind of relationship. And it was like, whoa, okay, that's that. Like all the intellectual stuff just checked out. And it can kind of let go. All it really does is if it checks out, it lets go. It doesn't do anything more. And then the aesthetic part checked out and it kind of holds. And then suddenly there was something more like the essential and the existential of, oh, okay, here we are. We're actually now sitting in the good. The beautiful brought us here, the truth coordinated, and now the good is actually present. Right? The hermeneutics of presence is maybe the way of ending that arc.
Well, I'm glad we got to the incarnation because that gives me the opportunity to ask the question that I want the next question I really wanted to ask you, actually. And Bonita Roy brought this up, actually, in a discussion we were having. I was listening to a podcast with Nick Cave. Do you know Nick Cave?
I don't think so.
He's like, he was in a band called The Birthday Party, and Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Hard rock dude. Very biblical, like in his early stuff, but he's the last guy you would ever think that would convert to Christianity. So I'm listening to him talk about how he's now going to church, and it was just a shock to his fans because but it was obviously intensely biblical all the way along, like just in the way he in his poetics, a bit like a Bob Dylan of hard rock or something like that.
Okay.
Or in any case, and I was listening, the interviewer was interviewing him and asked him this question, and which I wanted to ask you, which sounds like a bit of a cheeky question. But he asked the question like, what does Jesus mean to you? What does Jesus Christ mean to you? So and that was Bonita's question as well. So if you're a Christian, what is Jesus? Who is Jesus? What is that's the question. That's the big question. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have well, it's just better. This is an unlimited or there's not the full list. These are two things that come up that are in the foreground. So one is every time that I actually feel love and notice it, I remember that is a way of being in relationship with Jesus. So Jesus means to me the embodied experience, the experience of the human experience of love, the source of that. Like in some sense, like I can say, okay, I feel warmth and I look at the fire and I see the fire as the source of the warmth. When I feel love, I notice the presence of Jesus. So that's one thing of what he means to me. Is like, I am the light and the truth, the source of that. And then when I perceive it or experience it in creation, right, in physicality, in reality, I'm oriented towards the source of that and reminded of the source of that holds it together. The other aspect is this aspect of, let's say, the way, the like a hand reaching out in the darkness. Right? So the metaphor actually is funny. I came to this with Ken Lowry. The experience of you're in a cave, it's a dark cave, and you're trying to find your way out. So you're climbing and you're seeking kind of an upgrading. You're engaging in hill climbing. It's hard going, but you can kind of sense up and down. You're moving up. And then by the way, the opening of the transcendent is something like having a little bit of light and a little bit of fresh air that gives you a better sense of upness. And as you move up, there's a changing, because the upness doesn't change in the dark, but light does change as you move closer to the source of light. So the transcendent opens up that. You increase that as a directionality and dimensionality. But Christ is like if somebody drops a rope through that opening all the way down to where you are. And it's a hand, a thing that you can hold on to, that you can return to, that guides you in that directionality of up, which is equal to our capacity as deeply finite beings. Right? So this ability to return, the ability to participate in mercy, for example, like self-mercy, self-forgiveness. Okay. Once again, this is funny. Nowadays it's like, okay, once again, I came off the way, whatever it is. I got angry, I got confused, I got greedy, whatever it happens to be. Okay, and remember, yeah, that's right. You actually do love me in spite of all of that, and you are providing the way. You enter back into your mercy. You have mercy on me, restore me back, remind me of what it's like to be back on the way, and then let me now ask what's the direction I should go now? Like, what's the thing that needs to happen now? And that, by the way, can be found sometimes in scripture and sometimes in prayer. That last part, like what's the content of relationality, or in church. And in church here, I mean in terms of other people who are in the spirit. And that's actually also very powerful. So maybe a third piece is this concrete, like, directionality of choice. So, okay, I have gone off the way again. I'm tempted to use harsher language, but we'll just keep it.
You're a sinner. You're a lowly sinner.
Yeah, I'm a lowly. But this is when you're in the self-flagellation moment where you've actually
got it.
You're ashamed of yourself. Shame is probably the right place.
Yeah, shame. Yeah, got it. Yeah,
place of shame. So then you can tap into that mercy. That mercy is a mercy that you don't earn, you can't deserve. Right? It's not that kind of thing. It's infinite in nature and it's faithful. Well, it's a very powerful relationship to be in, is to have access to that. But it's not. It's a yoke. Right? It's a light yoke. It's an easy yoke, but it's a yoke nonetheless. Right? You go, okay, I accept that mercy, and now remind me, what is it where do I need to go now? Like, what's the right next step? And on occasion, I find myself, by the way, in my life, in circumstances where I've worked myself so through that I can't actually orient towards a right next step. Like, literally I'm just going to lay here and not even move. I got nothing. Well, Christ has something. So, like, what is it? And it might be a word from some person in the church. It might be something in scripture. It might be something in your prayers, but it gives you a next step. And the next step is usually simple. Apologize to your wife, or apologize to your child, or call up somebody who you have been not coming into right relationship with.
So the right next step in a way which you can't figure out on your own.
Yeah. And then that's how life works, is next steps. And so that's in some sense, to me at least, and this is now very sort of my particular and not wise theology, I really perceive the Father from the point of view of that light, like the notion that there is light at the end of the tunnel, the notion there is fresh air, the notion that there is the transcendent at all, but maybe a quality of the impersonal, like closer to the impersonal, very difficult to grasp what that relationship feels like. Whereas Christ is more about the deeply personal, like an actual dude. Yeah. That, his breath smells like something. He has like a shadow of beard if he doesn't shave, that kind of stuff, which is a very different quality. And that next stepness, and that real mercy. And I've had that experience in real life where, say, for example, with Vanessa, where she is in fact absolved me, like a relationship where I am in the wrong, and she has absolved me, not verbally, but at the heart level, and that open space. And of course, then like, oh, Christ is that, like, where that comes from in the reality at all, the fact that exists in reality at all, that's him. So that's my answer.
That's very beautiful. Yeah. Well, I guess the other question I still had, it's almost like that would almost be like a way to end this conversation, because I think that's a very deep place to be. But I was thinking about what you were saying about what we need. You said we need a congregation, or we need a church, we need to pray, these kind of things. These are like things that human beings somehow need to do. And so I was thinking about your notion of civium, and I was also thinking, Sangha, congregation. You can't really do it by yourself. Obviously, you need a congregation. I was thinking about Jordan Peterson's kind of Christianity. Some people, I don't want to be personal or anything like that, but the need to find some sort of some sort of sangha, some sort of congregation is essential, right? And then also the need to have a language, a deep language to call out to the divine in some kind of a way. So those two things struck me in your other conversations about. And I wonder why that you didn't come that, like, why don't people come to that conclusion? Like, I guess it's like, yeah, it's kind of obvious in a
Well,
way.
let's take this first one, the notion of congregation, because what we need is something that brings us into communion, and it's going to have three distinct characteristics. I think people don't think this way. This is why they didn't think this way. But then we need something that brings us into communion. So I'm gonna make that a postulate. You can defend it if we like, but a postulate. And it needs to have three distinct characteristics. One is it needs to bring us into a strong enough communion, sort of the trivial communion that breaks upon meaningfully bad, slightly bad stuff is not going to be very helpful. And the strength of communion is actually going to be rather high. The bar is high. And here I'm kind of pointing to more of the apocalyptic, eschatological, practical eschatology of like, shit is hitting the fan, it's going to get worse. So the fabric or the ligature, the liturgy, the raveling that makes our communion needs to be a strong weft. We need to be using good rope, hemp, with multiple different knots, right? We're not making this.
We're not going to do Netflix tonight. Whatever, that's not the right kind of communion.
That's not the right kind of communion, right? Because big things are up. Okay, second, it needs to include the whole of life. This is one of the biggest challenges with the flavors of communion that we tend to enter into. We enter into communion with a bicycling, triathlon club. Okay, but now I have to sort of trade off that communion with the communion with my family, and now but there's nothing larger that's integrating that into a full wholeness that allows those to be part of something. So it has to actually integrate the whole of life, and I mean not just my own life, but life itself. It has to integrate family and children and elderhood, and it has to integrate economy and nature. Right? We actually have to create a community that is strong enough, and it has to be complete enough. It needs to be holistic, the whole of life, the whole world.
Yep.
And then the last piece is both trivial and transcendent. It has to orient us into relationship with that which is of the ultima, or the actual ultima, the transcendent that is outside the whole of life, which is the only basis which can enable us to have proper orientation in a context as large as the whole of life. The only basis which can be strong enough to actually maintain us in the relationship with the most meaningful interventions. Right? So we need to have something like, say, true north, if you'd like, or the actual North Star, or the highest point, or the ultimate concern. And by the way, is able to bring things into their proper organization. What can provide the organizing principle that it can allow us to put the relationships inside our holistic communion into their proper balance? Like, well, when should I be spending time with my wife as opposed to my daughter? Well, that's actually very hard. Well, if I have something that transcends all of that and actually has an order built into it that is eternal, is utterly unsubject to the movement of time and space, then one, I can be sure that it's strong enough to deal with whatever, say, for example, the acceleration singularity throws at it. Because no matter how powerful that is, it's all powerful in the realm of the finite. So if this is coming from the location of the infinite, it's strong enough. And if it's coming from the location of the infinite, not undifferentiated, but actually with deep structure all the way down to the most minute level, then it's also clear enough and rich enough to inform, to provide the informing. So that would be the ingredient, the distinct characteristics of communion that are necessary.
Okay. So what about prayer? What does prayer mean to you? How do you pray? And what is that? What the hell? A lot of people don't even know what that means, I think, or don't just find it something childish.
So I was introduced to prayer as the thing that complements meditation. So meditation is the process whereby you become disconnected from the attachments and the habits of the monkey mind or of the ego mind. But then when you get to the very bottom of that, you are now in the place of a certain kind of purity, but also a certain kind of purity that lacks full capacity to come back into relationship with life, the world. Mm-hmm. So prayer is the characteristic of coming from a place that is transcendent to your ego, entering into choice, into action, and sourcing guidance from connection, relational connection, not abstract or semantic connection, but relational connection, sourcing guidance by virtue of actually being in something like a well-integrated wholeness with the world itself. And it's funny, I can do a metaphor at the mechanical level. It's a little bit like how the heart, the lungs, and the mind are part of a larger body, and therefore we resource each other. The heart is not operating separate from the lungs and the mind. It's operating in that context, and it has ways of being in relationship with them to guide it in its, we're running, better start beating faster, that kind of a thing. So it's like that, like it's actually being well held in relationship with the transcendent and with the immanent, part of the world, and then using that relationship to begin guiding choices in relationship with the world. So prayer is that category. Then you have to enter into the question, what are the practices of prayer that are appropriate to that category? But notice that distinction. Like the same thing happens with faith. It's like prayer, I've now kind of carved out a category that we don't have a good way of resolving that.
Which is fine, even if you're not a Christian or a Buddhist or anything else, you can still work with that.
Not only can, must, right? If you're not doing it intentionally and well, you're doing it poorly and arbitrarily.
And but you're doing it, like it's like
but you're doing it. Most of the time, you're sourcing. Well, if you're not doing the meditation piece first, then you're just doing ideology, right? You're not actually even, to use my old language, you're not thinking. Right. But when you've done the meditation thing first, you've gotten to the point where you actually can act from a place that is not governed by habits and ideology and attachments. But now we're in a new place. What does that kind of governance look like? How do you make those kinds of moves? Faith, by the way, is a key piece of it. Like faith is the faculty for navigating the domain of the transcendent. So then practices. So, for example, let's see, 3 practices that I've engaged in that have so far proven to be quite effective. One, which I really, really appreciate and I recommend, is a fasting and prayer practice. So fast, in this case, I fast Fridays. I'm fasting today as well, but that's, you know why. And pray, right? In this case, what I very specific, what I'll do is I will remind myself that when I feel the mental habits or the physical experiences that are kicked off by fasting. An image of a chocolate bar pops into my head, or a donut or something like that, or I just feel hungry. Use that to orient myself to gratitude, just pure gratitude. The basic prayer practice is bringing into consciousness mental and physical habits and grounding them or resuturing them into a disposition of gratitude, and gratitude not to any particular thing, but gratitude in general, like casting it out to the infinite.
Yeah, I like the word disposition. It's working on a disposition, isn't it?
Yeah, it's forming character. It's prayer is a practice of forming character, creating a disposition. Or discipleship is another nice piece, like discipline. Building something, it's crafting something, it's changing who you are so that you begin to act on the basis of a new quality of self.
And there's also the sense of emptying oneself out in order to receive new information or receive information that isn't self-generated or solipsistic, that's you've just created within your own world. You're getting outside information.
Let's do the other 2. So hold what you just said, because it's very, very proper. The second one is the proper ordering of values. So here's where you're sort of praying and you're orienting towards, okay, well, if I imagine, you could do it that way. If I imagine that there is an infinite agent that is willing to help me achieve the things that I'm looking for, And by the way, it does so the best when I am, or will only do so when what I am seeking is actually in the direction of the absolute good. I now have this really fun collaborative process of endeavoring to discern within myself, one, what are my values? Right, that's a simple process. What do I find myself praying for? This is praying forness process.
Mm.
But also beginning to have an inquiry into what ought I be valuing. Okay, and so Lord, if this is what I should be seeking, help me understand more deeply why this is the right direction, how I can get there, something like that. And if it's not what I should be seeking, help me have the insight to grasp why I have been attached to something that is actually not in your will. So that notion of subordination to a greater will, but with a faith or a confidence that it is oriented towards both what is the highest good for me and for the world, and has the capacity to navigate that, and then stepping into that space. For the ordering of my own personal values. So I'm learning, discovering how to order my personal values. And then as you say, that last piece is then opening information from outside. I acknowledge that humility, direct humility. Hey, I'm remembering that I am both deeply flawed and intrinsically finite. So the world that I'm engaging with overwhelms me and couldn't but overwhelm me. And so I'm asking for guidance, or I'm asking for something that can help me make, proper choices, to act rightly in the world, and to further, again, this is that mission of humility or subordination of your will. How can I further your will in this world? Please use me well as an instrument of your process.
Right. That's like the Jesus prayer is like, not my will but yours be done, something like that. Or
I don't know that as the Jesus prayer, but that's definitely part of, that's a good prayerful practice. There probably is a very particular term for it, but I don't know it. Jesus prayer that I know is that Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, or the sinner.
Yeah.
Learn from kind of the Orthodox guys. And then you have the Lord's Prayer.
Yep.
Right. Thy will be done.
Mm-hmm.
Thy will, not my will, is a sort of a very proper thing, which again just speaks to the notion of humility. Not to say that my will is not important, but from a theological perspective, it's one of the signature elements of Christianity that
so you
God,
have a will,
God granted,
or that your will is not separate from a higher will.
That God has granted us the keys to our own soul. Right? God will not we have full responsibility for our own soul. Right? We actually have sovereignty, very limited sovereignty, but nonetheless not zero. And therefore we have a will. Right? It's important. We can't not exercise our will. So when we say your will, not our will, what we're saying is guide us, help us understand how to deploy our sovereignty in a way which is in alignment with something which is much larger than us that we can't possibly understand. But we trust, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're coming upon this information very late,
Yes.
in your life, it would seem. Do you think that I was wondering about, like, is that an advantage in a way because you've become exhausted of all the other stuff, a lot of the other stuff? Like there's a phrase in Buddhism, to become weary with samsara, like to become just burned out from everything, and then there's a fatigue that overtakes us when we're trying to do everything, and we just can't, we can't do it. So then it seems like the religious understanding or insight often comes at that moment of intense, death experience or fatigue or
well, there's a bunch. So we'll take it from the optimistic side of you. So yeah, here are the advantages. Let's put it that way. Here are the advantages. One, for example, is that I had already worn a groove for the Trinity to drop into. Right? If you come to the Trinity cold, that's going to be a lot of work. Now, maybe if you spend 20, 30 years dedicated to it, you can make that happen on, maybe 5, I don't know what the number is, but if you come to it cold, it's going to be a lot of work. In my case, I'd already been doing that work, had a a Trinity-shaped groove in the
Yeah, you've been doing a lot of work, and I mean, you've been seeking a lot, right? Before
yeah.
this, so it's not like it's just coming from nowhere.
So
Yeah,
that was helpful, and then a lot of work in lots of different ways, like
yeah.
lots of, plenty of work on ego, for example, lots of work on that front. So that was an advantage. It has been an advantage. My life, my thrownness in life has developed in me certain capabilities and skills that I am now in a place of being able to gift into the church. It's like, hey, I am looking, I'm delighted to be able to gift, and I have some capacities that I have developed as a part of this life arc, right? So I'm coming in from the point of view of maturity, and therefore a certain capacity to help and to gift it in. Obviously, the caveats about humility and an arbitrarily large amount to learn. What was the last piece that came to me? You mentioned it was good.
Was about the exhaustion, maybe?
Yeah, the
Maybe.
exhaustion. Yeah. So, one of the things that I think is often the case when you're young, and maybe properly when you're young, certainly when you're young, one of the things you have to do is you have to exit the tribal mode of communion. This is, I think, a big problem in most religions, where you enter into communion. Let's say you're actually raised in the church and you're well in the church. And so you're entering into communion, but you may accidentally be entering into communion with the idol of the church that you're in, right? Whatever that works. And you have to go through a process of differentiation. You have to actually go through a leaving, a prodigal son exit, so that you can come back in, truly entering into communion with the divine, which is, requires a process of disillusionment with the things that you thought were God, realizing they're not God, and then coming back in.
They're just your own images or your own comfort or your own
whatever it was.
So, yeah, got it.
The kind of thing that the mind of an adolescent is going to build. Like, it's very difficult not to. But another thing that you often will run into is the feeling of kind of like, God is the sort of stern authoritarian stick in the butt. Like, hey, don't like have sex with a whole bunch of
God is dad.
or don't have sex with a whole bunch of random people. Like, don't go out do the sex, drug, and rock and roll thing. Everybody's like, oh, but I want to do the sex, drug, and rock and roll thing.
Yeah.
I am able to come from a place of saying, actually, as it turns out, I did the sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing. And it's actually not that great, because I am completely, how do I say,
you're cured of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah, I'm like, you know what? I am utterly uninterested. I actually grasp the wisdom of why those are, let's say, sinful. And what I mean is off the mark. Like, they are distractions. They will waste your time. Those are very good ways of putting it. Your time on earth is extremely, extremely limited, and they are not vaguely woven out of the fabric of the things that are actually meaningful, and will tend to take you further away. And so you get these digressions of like, oh my gosh, I spent 30 years, partying with people who aren't vaguely my friends because I got a hit of something simulating communion by means of MDMA or alcohol or rock and roll, whatever it happened to be. And now I am 3 decades later, meaningfully through my time on earth, and only one step closer to the things that I wanted anyway. Wow, what a horrible waste of time.
Well, the palace of excess sometimes, that quote from William Blake about the palace of excess leads to wisdom, or whatever. There's a way in which, I don't know. Anyway.
And there's, I can say, through the palace of excess, not as much as some, but more than most, I would say. And maybe it led to wisdom. And I can say from that place of wisdom to younger people, you don't necessarily have to go down that path. I mean, if it is the path that you're going to be going down, then I can help you there too, by the way. Don't do these things. That's a bad, I can tell you that's really for you. But for the most part, say, you're missing nothing. Like, if you're feeling that what you want to do is you want to be a mother, and you're 17, and you just feel very compelled to be a mother, but part of you feels a bit of like FOMO that you're missing out. I can tell you're not missing out. Like, having a career as the vice president of marketing at an ad agency is not a fulfilling thing. Becoming a billionaire is not a fulfilling thing, young man. There's a whole bunch of things that aren't actually going to be what you're looking for, as far as I can tell. And I can say this both first person and having conversations with lots of other people. And if you have a deeper pull in a different direction, maybe I can help you just like not have these things pulling you away. So you can just be committed. Like, yeah, if you really want to be a mother, yes, be a mother. It's a profoundly beautiful thing. And if that is where your heart's yearning, and all you feel is like a false attraction to something that I can assure you is profane, I will assure you it's profane, and hopefully free you, liberate you to pursue that which you actually yearn for anyway. Something like that. Like that can be something that perhaps I can have some service by coming to this so late. And an embodied humility, because I can now actually have a very high degree of clarity of like, wow, you guys know stuff that I will probably never really know, which I know is more meaningful than all this other stuff that I happen to know. Neat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about the suffering piece? Like, because it seems that Christianity places a lot of emphasis on this guy up on the cross being tortured to death, and what is the function of suffering, and how do you work through suffering on a spiritual
Nice.
level?
This is a great one. I actually had a conversation with at a pop-up city dedicated to longevity. You can imagine they have a strong aversion to the notion of suffering. So I would say it's a three-step process, and we're actually going to end up on Calvary with Jesus and the two thieves, right? It's important. Symbolically, all three are there. So first we open up the category of suffering, and we look at its etymology. We know that suffering in its essence literally just means to undergo. And so if I stand here and I walk over there, I have suffered the journey from here to there. It doesn't have any particular negative connotation, other than the fact that in the process of undergoing anything, I'm going to be having experiences. And so the category of suffering is the category, just like we talked about the category of prayer, the category of suffering is the category of meeting experience, entering into life and undergoing life, and being willing to accept the fact that in the process of undergoing life, there's going to be things that happen to me. I will be changed by that encounter. So that's suffering. Now, in the context of suffering, there's a subset which has to do with, let's call it just pain for the moment, painful suffering. Now, in the category of pain, we have the homily from the Western tradition, no pain, no gain. But specifically, what we're talking about here is that growth, transformation, is also death. And certain parts of you, when you're exercising, muscles are tearing, and certain parts of you are breaking or being broken up. And that's an inevitable necessity. As you encounter experience, you encounter life, you grow into life, that means some part of you is going to be going away. Some new parts of you are going to have to be shifted and broken to actually move in. So that experience is the experience of pain, so painful suffering. So then we have just the last term of meaningless painful suffering. Okay, so now I've got meaningless painful suffering. So now we're going to go to Calvary. And so we're up on the, it's not actually much of a hill, but we're up on the spot with the three crucified people. Jesus, one side, thief one side, thief two. Right? So thief one is engaged in painful suffering. He's being crucified. But he has the experience of, oh my gosh, you're God. You are salvation. And at that moment, like literally the moment of crucifixion, he's able to transform painless suffering from meaningless painless suffering to meaningful painless suffering. In fact, the most meaningful possible. So symbolically, he represents the category of how we can be in relationship with painful suffering, but by orienting it towards the maximum direction of growth, recognizing that pain plays a role, we can orient ourselves towards the meaningful directionality. So
he stays awake during the suffering, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
I was just thinking of my own experience when I was suffering, and there have been times, when I had a couple surgeries where I was just out of it. And I had no sort of connection to anything. And I thought, God, if I die like this would be terrible. And then other moments where I had some feeling of gratitude and love and, meaning. And so it's like the two thieves are living within us all the time.
Oh, yes, all the time. So the example I have that landed most powerfully is I have a friend who's one of the best body workers I've ever encountered. And he was putting me through a particular process, and it was extremely painful. Like he was putting me to the absolute edge of the amount of pain that I could endure because I have bad habits. I'm on my phone typing in all kinds of junk. And I had this beautiful experience of like, oh my gosh, this is super painful. Like I am suffering agony. And then I had this realization of, yeah, but I trust him completely. Like I absolutely trust him, both in terms of competence and goodwill. Like he's here to help, and he can help. So now what I need to do is I need to orient myself towards surrendering into the suffering, surrendering into the pain, so that the work that needs to be done can actually be done all the way down. Like if I'm going to suffer pain, I want to have the consequences of that be as productive of growth and health as possible.
Yeah, because the other guy on the cross is, doesn't have a friend. He's just, that's the most lamentable state to be in.
He suffers pain meaninglessly. He literally rejects meaning. He rejects Christ. He actually is present to the possibility. He chooses the path of rejecting, and therefore consigns himself to perfectly meaningless pain. So that's the category of suffering there. So now what you have is a much richer tableau, which Christ sits right smack in the center of, right, representing the maximum pain and the maximum meaningfulness simultaneously, and the locus, or the symbolon, that which brings us together, symbolon, that which brings us together, the symbolon that allows us to participate in the orientation towards maximally meaningful suffering. And so how's that as a phrase coming from Christianity towards Buddhism?
Maximal meaningful suffering. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's the same. I mean, well, they're different. I think all the religions are the same and different. Let's, whatever conclusion you come to, if it's the ultimate conclusion and the deepest conclusion, it can be found in multiple different places. But that's quite something. Yeah, the three guys and Jesus up there. Yeah.
Yeah, and remember, like in the Christian architecture, Jesus is God, right? So you literally have that which is eternal, that which is infinite, that which is perfect. The word is condescending, or coming down to, choosing to come down, to engage in maximally meaningful suffering out of love for us. Like all of these, every single one of these pieces are a build. Like it's all of that is a build. So that, out of love for us, so that we can reconcile, we can become the thief on the left. We can transform the necessity of our experience, the fact that we are going to be suffering, and the necessity of pain in that experience into meaningful, or at least oriented in that direction, which is, by the way, called theophany in Eastern traditions, as I understand it.
Theophany means suffering nobly.
The process of becoming more and more like God.
The process of becoming more, right. Oh, got it. Okay.
All right, man. I think we may be done.
Okay, yeah, that felt very, very, very rich and a lot to digest. So thanks so much for doing that, Jordan.
Yeah, just I feel like I need to continually caveat. So remember, you and anyone who wants to watch this, I'm doing my best, but I don't really know that much. So if my theology is wrong, I apologize. And if it's heretical, I willfully will submit to being burned at the stake. I do not endeavor to bring anybody off the mark, and I'm doing. And if I'm making mistakes, just please go to somebody else who's deeper and wiser than me to get better guidance.
Okay, thanks so much, Jordan, and thanks for your conscientiousness and and all your thoughts over the years.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. Well, have a beautiful day, my friend.